very recently made the leap to startup land myself as an operator. So I'm now working as go-to-market lead at JDoodle. If I can't figure out a way of getting a conversation with a bunch of these people, it's going to be very difficult for me to build a product for them. Suddenly you'll start to unpeel a bunch of layers that you didn't know existed. They just built stuff. They put out a landing page, they test it with they had an early investor, so they're able to test it with their investor and some of their networks. What hurdles can I put in place that they are willing to jump over because they believe in what I'm doing?
Like, how did you get into shoemaking? Is there like a course on that, or tell us about how did that happen?
You know, once upon a time there was a course at TAFE, New South Wales. And so the importance of craft in building a product and thinking about every little detail of the experience as a user begins from beginning to end, I think is critical. And that's what I take away from a very strange career in shoemaking.
Just before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, can you please make sure you subscribe or follow my channel? This helps me out tremendously. Luke Hakewill, welcome to the Fail Wisdom podcast.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show and looking forward to hearing about your story and your journey. And you've worked in a whole bunch of different incubators and universities, and you have a lot of experience in that area. So I'm sure you can pass on a lot of knowledge and wisdom to early stage startup founders. So let's get straight into it. Tell us a little bit about Luke and what you've been doing and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I've had a weird career. I spent 5 years working as a bespoke shoemaker while I was studying. I studied computer science and music. And so I've had these sort of various moves from bespoke shoemaking to I worked in tech at a couple of big companies at Schneider Electric and Westpac. Saw how things happen in a large corporate and decided that I found it a little slow for my taste. And so pretty quickly discovered that I was more interested in this startup side of things. And so went to work first of all at Sydney University at their startup Accelerator Incubate, helped them develop their early stage startup entrepreneurship program called Proto. And then more recently, I was at the University of New South Wales leading their 10X Accelerator program, where we invested in, I worked directly with 13 companies as part of the accelerator there, and then coached hundreds of other companies. Very recently, made the leap to startup land myself as an operator. So I'm now working as go-to-market lead at JDoodle.
So you're taking the leap.
I've taken the leap. It's an Australian startup. It's an education technology company. So we provide the infrastructure for universities, schools to teach coding.
I'm interested, like, how did you get into shoemaking? Is there like a course on that, or tell us about how did that happen?
You know, once upon a time there was a course at TAFE, New South Wales.
Right.
And so it was an important trade in New South Wales and in Australia. I suppose we talk a lot about sovereign capability and sovereign manufacturing capability now. Shoes were, I suppose, an important manufacturing capability for any country. And so I guess it was just a passion project. I loved shoes, still do. And anything that I love, I would love to turn my hand to making. And so I managed to do a course at TAFE at the old School of Footwear, which incidentally now houses the Sydney School of Entrepreneurship, where I briefly worked as well.
Interesting.
In a beautiful old building. Did that course at School of Footwear, and then managed to fall into a job making shoes for film and theatre. So one of the first things that I did on the job was hand stitching on the boots for one of the dwarves in The Hobbit.
Oh, really?
And that was a lot of very intense, very detailed work for something that didn't appear on screen for many more than a few seconds. So a lot of love goes into I suppose each pair of shoes. And
Yeah.
the thing about that I think is important, and the lesson that I take into my other career in startups, is the importance of craft. And so as founders, as people with ideas, we're told, and it's important, I think, to think about what's the minimum viable product. How do we get something to market quickly,
Yeah.
regardless of the bugs, regardless of whether it's a bit janky? And I think that's an important concept, but equally important as a founder or as someone building a product is that whilst you're trying to avoid perfection, what you're building has to be excellent. You're trying to build something that's 10 times better than the alternative at the moment. And so you kind of have to hold those two things in your mind at the same time. Yep, got to get something out there quickly, but also got to make it excellent, if not initially, eventually. And so the importance of craft in building a product and thinking about every little detail of the experience as a user begins from beginning to end, I think is critical. And that's what I take away from a very strange career in shoemaking.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I interviewed somebody in the space, Alan Jones, lovely gentleman. You probably know him. And
I do.
It's Alan Jones, but not that Alan Jones, the good one. Anyway, if you're in Australia, you know what I'm talking about. And he was saying, I think he was saying that the product manager he feels is the most important person in a startup, and also, of course, marketing and sales. So yeah,
and if you're
go on.
And if you're an early stage founder,
Yeah.
you don't have $150,000 a year to pay a product manager. You are the product manager.
Yeah, you are everything.
Yeah.
When you first start, pretty much you're the sales guy, the marketing guy. You know, you could be the developer, you could be the product manager. You're the person that's looking after if anyone else is in the business. And yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying and getting the craft right. But it is no wonder it's so stressful in the space, because you need something that's really good. It's 10x like anything else. But at the same time, like, you don't want to make the mistake that I did and spend 4 or 5 years developing some major platform, not really knowing, not really spending much on sales and marketing, because I had this conversation quite a lot. And now, if I was to do it again, I make something really simple that just works and can show what I do, and then put all the time, effort, and money into sales and marketing, or even selling a future vision. I think if you're a really good salesperson and you have a really good idea, if you can sell a future vision, then you got customers that are going to come on, and then you can create it, and then you've got that income happening. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Paul, I guess in many cases as founders, we're trying to make a product that's excellent, but that also covers a lot of ground. So we think that we have to cover the entire user journey, or we have to incorporate all of the features of the incumbent, plus we do all of this extra stuff. And whilst that might be the end state, like you said, you kind of want to get something out early.
Yeah.
And we could spend a bunch of time building a janky version of something that covers that whole user journey and nothing's very good. Or we could try and focus on a particular area.
Yeah.
Now, if we're able to spend enough time with our potential customer, learn enough about what they really need, what's the one thing that they would drop everything to use your product, even if missing a bunch of features and there's no single sign-on and there's no everything, like they have to build their workflow around your product, but because you do this one thing, it's one killer feature that we're going to incorporate your thing into our workflow because it just solves this very specific problem for us. That's kind of the classical, I suppose, lean startup approach advice and the way of thinking about how do I avoid spending 4 or 5 years in the basement. The other thing that you said, Paul, is like, how do you sell a vision? Okay, we haven't built it yet, but here's what we're thinking. Help me prioritize. Help me understand what needs to come first. And then I suppose you have the kind of antithesis to that is like I guess you could call it the Steve Jobs approach, or the sort of the visionary approach, where I'm a founder with incredible product vision. Nobody understands me. Everyone thinks when the iPad was released, it was like, what is this? It's got a terrible name. What is this product? Everyone kind of made fun of it. Now everyone has an iPad. So I think that, again, I guess maybe there's the importance of that product vision is critical, because you can't abdicate that to your customers. Your customers can't bring you a product vision. You have to have that, and it's a strong belief, lightly held, but the vision has to be aware of, how does my customer live their life? What's their job to be done? What problem am I solving for them? How do I make it fit within their day-to-day life so that adoption is not going to be a challenge? So I think having an exciting vision for the future, having a vision for what does the 10x better product look like, and then being able to kind of eat humble pie and scale down that vision to what can we do in the next 3 months, and how can we find the people who need this scaled down version. I think that's a critical approach there.
Yeah, it's really good advice. And look, having worked with hundreds of startups or startup founders, what do you think are some of the keys to, success? I know we talk about failures, but failures to learn from and to, become successful. So what are some of the key things with those startups that have really, apart from what you're saying now, that have really gone well and made it in the space and got investments, or gone on to do some really good stuff, compared to the ones, and unfortunately the many, because we know it's only few that really succeed. So what are some of the things you've seen in the space with those founders and those startups, what they're doing that could increase that success rate?
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you an example of a company that went through 10x Accelerator, which is the startup accelerator at University of New South Wales. So UNSW Founders is the entrepreneurship program there. I ran the 10x Accelerator, which invests into 6 companies a year. And way back when, in 2017, when I was yet a blip on the horizon, was not part of UNSW, a company came through called Forage. Previously, they were called Inside Sherpa at the time, but the company's now called Forage. They were just acquired this year, just announced their acquisition. Probably kind of the biggest success story that we talk about at the 10x Accelerator. And I got to interview Pasha Ryan, who's the CTO, a couple of times while I was at the Accelerator. And I think there's a few really great lessons from that story. When they joined the Accelerator, what they were planning was a platform for career mentoring. So let's say you're a student. They were students themselves. They really wanted to solve this problem for students, of particularly international students. How do I get a job? I've finished my degree. I've spent a bunch of money on this piece of paper. I'm in Australia. I don't have a work visa. Nobody wants to sponsor me. What the hell do I do? And so they deeply felt and cared about this problem as students. They had an idea about what the solution was. Okay, let's connect students with mentors who can, maybe they pay them $20 and they'll review their resume and do a mock interview. They built the platform. They tested it out. bit of interest, but nothing super exciting. So the thing that I take from this that they did during the Accelerator was they were builders. They just built stuff. They put out a landing page, they test it with they had an early investor, so they're able to test it with their investor and some of their networks. They'd send it out, they'd just see what happened. And so they set up a notification on Slack for every time someone signed up. And so each time they put out a product, they'd sit there waiting, looking at Slack, like, what's happening? We've sent this out. And so because they were able to move so quickly on product, test something out quickly, just put together a landing page. Here's what we think the value proposition is. Here's a couple of screenshots of mock-ups of what it would look like. And here's what you get. And then send it out into the world. They did a bunch of these tests over 10 weeks. And at some point, they tested out this idea of, what if you could do a virtual internship at a venture capital firm and see what it looks like to be an analyst at the VC that's invested in us? What does that look like? And they put out this landing page for do a virtual internship. I think I know the name of the firm, but I'm not 100% remembering, so I don't want to say it wrong. Maybe we can go back and put it in the show notes. Do this virtual internship at a VC firm, sent it out, and suddenly started to get these pings on Slack. And so Pasha tells this story of just feeling his phone kind of started to go ping, ping, ping. And that feeling of, look, we don't know how we'll make money from this. We don't know what the business model is. We haven't built the product yet. But we know that there's some kind of product market fit with this because we sent it out to our audience, we tested it, and they really gel with this value proposition. Something about it gets people excited. The things that I take away from that story are, A, if you are a founder, you need to be able to ship product quickly and iterate on your product quickly. And if you can't, which in many cases, if you're building deep tech or if you have to hire an agency to build your product, in many cases you might not be able to, but it is a disadvantage to not be able to make changes on the fly. And so that's where SaaS founders and software founders have a big advantage. And so if you are trying to build SaaS or software and you don't have that advantage, hey, it's going to be a real hard road. But if you can't, okay, anyway, anyone can make a landing page on Webflow, right? Anyone could have done that test that Forage did by building a landing page and some wireframes. So you should be able to iterate multiple times a week on your value proposition and test it out. And if you're not moving that fast, then that's potentially a problem. So that commitment to, hey, we really think this is going to work, and then realizing pretty quickly this isn't working, let's try something else. I think that's what worked for Forage early on. And I think without that early discovery of some, I suppose, product user fit, they wouldn't have then gone on to have the success where their business model was selling to Fortune 500 companies. Hey, you can access all of the millions of students on our platform with a virtual internship program. You pay us a bunch of money to run this on our platform, and we will, by the way, the people who complete your virtual internships, they'll have a much higher success rate at hiring. It's a much lower acquisition cost than other channels for you. And so corporates love it because they get better interns and grads. and more diverse interns and grads than they would through traditional channels.
So it's a real win-win. Yeah.
It's a win-win. They found a great win-win
Yeah.
business model.
Yeah, it's a great example. Yeah, and SaaS products do have an advantage. I interviewed one of the founders of Twitter, and he was saying Twitter was made in a hackathon, built in 6 hours, and all they did is just keep changing with custom feed. Put it out there and change, according to the feedback that they got, and added different things. So, sort of similar story, I guess. And okay, so that's one of the more successful ones. What common traits do you see in those that unfortunately do not make it through, fail on their particular startup at that time? Because they say that you need to do about 7 startups before you're successful in a lot of cases. But what do you see? I could step you through mine and tell you like a whole lot of different reasons. But what do you see as a common sort of thread, or what areas are those that don't succeed?
Well, I think that the converse is one, which is not being able to iterate on or make changes to the product quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Where at that early stage where we either don't have any revenue or most of our revenue is more consulting than product, you don't know what's going to work. And so you might be selling a vision, you might have an MVP, but chances are it's not good enough. And realistically, you probably know it's not good enough and you desperately want to improve it. So as a founder, if you're then relying on other people to deliver something and you're either paying them because they're an agency or you're not paying them and they're your mates and you're building together, if your velocities of product development is too slow, you'll suffer. Now, product development is one important component. Another arguably more important component is customer development. And so Steve Blank's work is really important on this. He talks about the distinction between product development, customer development. But essentially, what I mean by customer development is figuring out who wants to use this thing that we're building, who's going to pay for it, how do they live their life or conduct their work right now? What's difficult about that? What are they trying to achieve? So their jobs to be done, or customer jobs, you'll hear different examples there. What are they trying to achieve? So the Forage example, okay, a grad recruiter at a Fortune 500 company, what do they want? They need to fill a certain number of spots in a grad program, and they have diversity quotas and they have quality quotas, and by the way, they have to run an onboarding for 100 grads in 3 months, so they run off their feet. So what can we do? What are they trying to achieve? And then how can we make their life easier as part of that? If we've already semi-onboarded all these grads through Forage because they've done a day in the life at JP Morgan, it's going to be a lot easier to onboard them as a grad. So you're solving a job to be done for the customer. The way that founders do this customer development, it starts with what you would call customer discovery. How can I have a conversation with 20 of the people who I think I'm eventually going to try and sell a product to?
Yeah.
If I can't get a conversation with 20 of them, how am I going to sell something to them if I can't figure out how to get a conversation with them? And so that customer discovery process, whilst it's very important from the perspective of understanding their jobs to be done, their needs, how do we build a great product for them, it's also just a great filter for you of, if I can't figure out a way of getting a conversation with a bunch of these people, it's going to be very difficult for me to build a product for them. And so maybe either I'm not the right person because I don't have the networks, or my outreach approach is wrong, or like it's a very cheap and easy way of testing, can I sell to this market? Um,
Good point.
and so I think that customer discovery approach important. And then, okay, we found out who we think we're building for. We've got a sense of here's the type of company that we're selling something to, or here's the individual. We've got a group of 20, 30, 100 people who we think is that, and they told us that they have a problem, and we started to see a theme in what they were saying. And hey, we think we can build a product for them. Great. How do we make sure that we then, if we know that that product's going to take 6 months to build, how can we get some evidence that that customer base actually wants it? So that's when we think about selling the vision. Okay, we had a bunch of conversations with those customers. Therefore, can I get them on a wait list? Can I get them to commit to buying in 6 months' time? Can I get their testimonial about how much they want this? What hurdles can I put in place that they are willing to jump over because they believe in what I'm doing?
Yeah.
So the higher the hurdle, the better the evidence that you have as a founder that this is an individual who's willing to pay. So low hurdle might be, tell me, yes, I'm interested in using that. Slightly higher hurdle might be, add your email to the waitlist. Slightly higher might be $50 pre-order. So that's where you get crowdfunding campaigns or pre-orders. Highest might be, I'm working with a corporate customer and they're willing to front up the money and work with me while we build this. So you can think of it as kind of a scale of conviction. How do you, as a founder, build enough conviction from those early customers that gives you the commitment that you want to go continue making that product?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And just looking back myself in those early days, talking about customer discovery, and we did some, and then, it seemed like people liked what we had, but going further and trying to get people to actually say, okay, commit to something in 6 months, or doing some of the steps that you said. Let's say if that didn't work, at least you have an early indication before you put a huge amount of effort and money into something. And I think a lot of founders, I don't know if it's fearful, but it's like, oof, it's like I'm not a salesperson, like, oh, how can I ask them for like a pre-sale type of thing, or their interest, or, you feel a bit nervous, particularly at the beginning. When I started, I was a bit like, I don't, it's a bit hard to ask these questions. You just want, oh, okay, you like it. Oh, that's great. And then you don't go any further. But anyone can say they love something, but then it's only really if they commit, or, when the money goes in your bank or whatever, that you really, really know. And it might be hard, it might be difficult at the beginning to do that, but if you can, then, geez, you could save yourself a lot of problems. And on top of that, you could take off quicker if it is really working. And you already have customers ready to go. So I think that's some brilliant advice there, Luke.
And here's the really nice thing about this. Okay, so pick a corporate example. Okay, we've had a conversation with someone working in corporate and they've said, great, I love this. And now you say, cool, well, okay, in the future, this is going to cost you $50,000 a year. But because the product's not quite there yet, we need your input and support. We're going to give you a 90% discount. Are you ready to sign up? And okay, well, yes, that will give you some indication of intent. Not sure. Okay, probably they can't give you an answer straight away. But if they're really keen and you're then able to convince them to start the process, suddenly you'll start to unpeel a bunch of layers that you didn't know existed. And they'll say, oh yeah, okay, so I spoke to the procurement people and here's all of these forms that you have to fill out. And by the way, what are your SLAs? And do you have a master services agreement? And here's
Yeah.
a bunch of extra stuff that
Yeah.
we hadn't uncovered yet, that now this person who's the champion within this organization sort of has to help you dig out.
Yeah.
And
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 get all the
so
other stakeholders on board. No, you need all the stakeholders on board.
yep, so you might have a champion, but okay, if we need to implement this, uh, does this now need cybersecurity approval and the CTO to sign off? And what are all of the steps here? And until you ask the question, it's very difficult to get a sense of what that process looks like.
Yeah.
Another example of this that I really like that takes it into a completely consumer lens as opposed to a business to business lens is a company that I worked with in the Accelerator called Amplefolk. So they make size inclusive activewear, and the first product was a sports bra, an adjustable sports bra for plus size women. And there was a bunch of R&D work that the founder Holly had put into this sports bra. It was on prototype number 12. We tested all these materials, and it still had a ways to go before the bra was ready for sale. And she'd done a bunch of work on unit economics. How much do we price it? Great, customers really want this, but the product's just not quite there yet. We've got a wait list. What do? We're in an accelerator. They were in 10x, and it became clear that we wouldn't have the product ready for sale during the accelerator. And so Holly and I had a discussion. Is there something else? Is there something easier you can do? How can you, okay, if we're coming up to the demo day at the end of the accelerator where you're pitching to investors, how can you put your best foot forward and show traction and demonstrate to yourself that, hey, we can sell stuff to this group of customers who's interested, and all of the complexity that comes around that of warehousing and logistics and pricing and ordering and all of the stuff that is involved with e-commerce and B2C businesses. How can you start to prove that you can do this and run a profitable B2C business before you've perfected the flagship product? So she's like, oh yeah, I've got a giant list of products that I want to do. What about towels? So Holly ran a pre-order for towels, and so traditional towels, the kind of standard towel size, actually isn't size inclusive. It's not a fit for a plus size person, and so she saw this niche, ran a pre-order campaign, sold out, ran a second pre-order campaign, sold out, did a bunch of new colors, built a business that was generating cash flow, that had all of those systems in place from a much simpler product that also fulfilled the needs of her customers. And so now she has a bunch of SKUs, a bunch of different product lines in development, and the bra's still in development, but everything else is kind of there, and she's had the opportunity to build a marketing machine, build a customer base that means that when the flagship product is there, here's a bunch of people who are willing to buy. So I really like that story because it's like getting out there as quickly as possible and with the smallest possible product offering that solves a point for that customer.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, and who knows? Like, in that situation, the towels could have taken off more than the plus size bras. You never know. Like, you got to be open to that stuff as well, and not just like, oh, this is my product or my service or my SaaS or whatever. It might be something. Sometimes you have to pivot to other things as well. I don't know exactly you call that pivoting, but they're or a different version or something else that just starts working and people want. You got to be open to that. To like as a startup founder, obviously you're changing every day pretty much. To all the different things that are happening. Yeah, that's a really good example. All right, so you've worked at a couple of universities, and is there is there any rivalry between Sydney University and University of New South Wales? Is there some sort of rivalry there, or friendly rivalry, or not friendly rivalry?
Oh, I think you could describe a relationship that's both collaborative and has some friendly rivalry.
Okay.
So UNSW is quite vocal about its position as the most entrepreneurial university in Australia. It's a critical part of the university's strategy is supporting entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And universities do compete for students for who can generate the most research funding. And so if you look at a university ranking system like QS or KILT or in those domains, universities are fiercely competitive, whilst at the same time they do collaborative research projects together. Everyone's moving between universities as employees. And so how would I put it? It's not like two startups who have a very similar product where actually it might just be a zero-sum game, winner takes all.
Yeah.
That's not the vibe.
Yeah.
And we collaborated really closely with our colleagues on some events. In some cases, a university startup program is typically only investing in its alumni, or most of its programs are for its alumni, staff, and students.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we're not competing for deal flow because it's generally a different audience. But everyone wants to be the best.
Yeah, I mean, you can see my jumper I'm wearing. So it's Macquarie University Incubator. I worked out of there for about 4 years. So that's another great university, and I think it's great if everyone can collaborate. There's so much room to do so many things, and I think we should all be collaborating and helping the founders. And I mean, Macquarie wasn't exclusive to Macquarie students. I mean, I studied at UTS, and UTS I think is open as well, their program. But yeah, there's a lot of great things happening now in the space. Even probably over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been dramatic changes. And have you seen that yourself, like working in that area, the growth in the whole startup ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think we have ebbs and flows in Australia, particularly related to political will. And so you see a change in government and a new treasurer or a new whoever's responsible for these types of programs, of course, wants to make their stamp. And so the issue that I think we see in Australia is long-running programs like MVP Ventures in New South Wales or what used to be called accelerating commercialisation from the federal government. If it's been a project that a previous government set up and announced, it's not very politically expedient then to just continue funding it and say that's a great thing that should continue. A new government wants announceables. They want things that they're able to say that they're doing that are tangible. And so unfortunately, changes in government tend to result in instability. So you saw that with the MVP Ventures program being put on hold and eventually was reopened. That can have really devastating effects on startups who might be relying on that grant funding as their first source of capital.
It's pretty rude. It's pretty rude, in my opinion, just shutting it down.
I think that what I've heard, that the worst example of that is the Boosting Female Founders initiative, where I think a bunch of people had basically been told that they would receive the money and then had that reneged. So I think that's an ongoing issue, and so political will, I think, is important. If I talk about universities specifically and their support for startups, the reason that I think that it's so important is that help for early stage startups is not a hugely profitable game. And so commercial operators who help early stage startups typically rely on either fee for service or can we do a good enough job of this and do a good enough job of qualifying the people who are coming in that we see at the end of our program, we see a bunch of startups that we can invest in at very favorable terms to us. And we think that eventually they will go on to be great successes. It's part of our portfolio. So early stage startup support, in my view, is best when it is philanthropic in nature, when it doesn't rely on making a monetary return or charging anyone money.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think universities have a role here because they are essentially an arm of government, publicly funded. They're education institutions. They're R&D powerhouses where they're researching and developing the new technology that could and should go into new ventures.
Yep.
And they're motivated to see success stories. And so I think as early stage startup supporters, universities are pretty uniquely placed, provided there's enough will from leadership to, as it does in university, in UNSW, keep that as a key pillar of the university strategy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Governments as well. Like we were going to build some virtual reality scenarios with this organization that do this really good work where they strengthen the neural pathways of the brains of kids that are from families where there's been a lot of abuse, and it helps them for the rest of their life. Like, they can concentrate, and it was a really, really good project and cause with this charity. And it was with the previous government, like federal government, and they had a couple of the ministers on board and was all looking good. And then the election happened, new government, and the project was completely canned. So, yeah, I completely relate to that, unfortunately. Now, you did a recent podcast where you talked about stress and pressure and stress management pretty much. So what are some of the most effective stress management techniques you've discovered or recommended to entrepreneurs facing the entrepreneurial journey, which is can be a very stressful journey?
So I think different things will work for different people based on their preferences. Mm-hmm. And one of the worst things I think that someone who's struggling with their mental health or physical health can hear is that person who comes up to you and says, "Oh, have you tried yoga?" Or, aren't you doing mindfulness? Or who thinks that their cure is the one for you. Mm-hmm. So I'm hesitant to say like this is one size fits all. I don't think this is something that I've solved either. Here's my thoughts on this topic. Starting a company is incredibly stressful and hard. All of those things that I said around velocity of product development, around talking to heaps of customers, around trying to make early sales, you're trying to execute on so many things so quickly. You're trying to be so many things to so many people, and you're not making a salary in most cases. Yeah. Or if you are, it's an additional pressure because you're doing consulting or you're doing your full-time job on top of the startup. So um, it's a pressure cooker, and my observation is that founders who manage to navigate this, they have probably a few things in common, which is one, they've figured out the activities or the things or the parts of their day that give them back energy. I'm borrowing a lot of this from a company that I work with in the 10x Accelerator called Tank. I'll share a link with you afterwards. And the co-founder, Dr. Helen Lawson-Williams, she's a psychologist, an organizational psychologist who's worked with a lot of people who've burnt out. And what Helen's research and Helen's product indicates is avoiding burnout is not necessarily just a function of getting lots and lots of rest or having a really unstressful life. In fact, a certain level of stress is required for performance. If your stress is too low, you'll perform badly. If your stress is too high, you'll perform badly. If you have the correct amount of stress that's challenging you, then you can perform at a high level. And sometimes if you need to perform at peak performance, then that's going to be higher stress, but you have to manage that with periods where you can perform at a slightly lower level. So the thing that Helen says that I resonate really with is it's not about like you can only do 38 hours of work a week, and if not, then you'll be too stressed and you'll burn out. It's more about what are the periods within your day, within your week, where you're doing things that bring you back energy, that help you to recover. And so for me personally, discovering that sitting on the couch is not one of those things. It feels restful, but it doesn't actually necessarily help me recover.
Yeah.
Actually, exercise, going for a walk or lifting some weights, that's the thing that gives me enough energy that I can go back and feel energized by the work again. For you, that might be meditation, that might be yoga, that might be exercise, that might be sitting on the couch, that might be spending time with friends and family. Whatever are the things that bring you back the energy, you need to intentionally find the time to be able to do them. And it doesn't have to be large periods of time. It has to be enough that it's bringing you back to enough energy.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Really good point. I also interviewed a organizational psychologist, Liz Swigart. So her episode is a while back now, but she has some really great advice as well. Yes, really good points with that. So to finish off, Luke, all this entrepreneurial journey that you've been on and working all these in the space there, what have you learned about yourself?
I think what I've learned about myself is I can change my my approach, my personality, my expertise. And if I spend too much time in one role or doing one thing, I get bored too quickly.
You're in the right space. You're in the right space in the startup entrepreneurial space, because change is the only thing that doesn't change, so to speak. So yeah, change is constant.
So I think for me, it was discovering, what's the threshold of how much of one focus area can I commit to, but also understanding the downside of that, which is that I have a tendency to be a generalist, to spread myself thin, to have shallow knowledge of many topics, and that can be an issue too. And having some spikes or if you think of a T-shaped expertise, having some depth of expertise is critical. And so what I've observed about myself is my tendency is to just want to be really shallow and broad and across everything. That actually I need to put some stakes in the ground and commit time to building expertise in specific areas. For non-technical founders, I think this one is really important, particularly working at a university. If you're a student founder, you're coming out of your degree usually without too much of that deep depth of expertise, and you'll find it hard to develop a great idea that really solves a problem for someone unless you can very quickly develop that depth of expertise in a field.
Yeah, and some life experience helps as well, obviously.
It helps.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, look, I think you've really provided some really wonderful advice today and some great examples. And I really appreciate your time and coming on the show. And I know you're going to be launching a podcast yourself soon. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that and where people will be able to find your podcast?
Absolutely. I don't have a launch date for you yet, Paul, but it's called Programmable. So it's a podcast by Jay Doodle where we speak with leaders in technical fields, founders and educators, people who've done the journey of studying computer science or being a coder, where that's taken them in their career and what are the exciting things that they have learned along the way. So it's really for students, early career folks and teachers in that computer science realm to hear inspiring stories. You'll be able to find it anywhere you find a good podcast, and I'll certainly share the link with Paul once we've got a link to the program. Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah, I mean this podcast will go up in a few months anyway, so it might be going by then. So fantastic. So yeah, it seems like it's a really interesting area for students. So wish you all the best in your podcast, and thank you for coming on mine.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
It's a pleasure.